What is up, everyone? Welcome to the Done Before Dawn podcast. I am your host, Isaac Skin and Bones Jones. Got some pretty interesting stuff to talk about today. We're going to cover Roe v. Wade being overturned. We're going to talk about the various arguments that I've seen comparing these to comparing the abortion rights to gun rights, and to comparing the abortion rights to the COVID vaccine mandates that happened in a bunch of states. I've seen some very interesting arguments made on social media. I brought along my Rights, Freedoms, and Justice, my constitutional law textbook that covers the most important Supreme Court cases in the history of the United States. Read over some of those for comparison. I'm going to lean a lot on my studying about a year ago for this constitutional law class. We're going to talk about enumerated versus unenumerated rights and what that means. We're going to talk about personhood, and we're going to talk about the comparisons between the Roe v. Wade being overturned, the Roe v. Wade case being overturned, or Roe v. Wade ruling being overturned, and the comparisons that are being made to gun rights and to COVID. So, first things first, you have to understand about the Constitution. The Founding Fathers knew that there was stuff that they were going to miss in the Constitution. They knew there was stuff that they were going to not cover in the Constitution. They left room for the people to add and take away amendments because they knew that they did not cover everything that would happen in the future of the country, and they knew that the people coming along them would be able to form their own opinions and add and take stuff away from the Constitution. To do that via amendment is extremely hard. It takes 2/3 vote in the House and the Senate. It's very complicated. The Supreme Court has to rule that it's constitutional, not unconstitutional. A bunch of stuff has to happen for a right to be added or taken away via amendment. For instance, the slave amendments, the two kinds of rights that are in the Constitution are enumerated and unenumerated rights. Enumerated rights are the rights that are spelled out explicitly in the text without question. Easiest ones to cover in like the first 5 amendments: freedom of speech, freedom of press, practicing whatever religion you want to, as long as you don't harm anyone, the freedom to say what you want, the freedom to do what you want, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, all those things that are spelled out explicitly in the Constitution, the right to bear arms. As much as people probably don't like it, or as much as some people probably don't like it, most people do like it. Second Amendment explicitly spells out the right for the people to keep and bear arms. You can argue what a militia is. The court has ruled that a militia, it means the individual. That's spelled out explicitly. Also spelled out explicitly is your right to an attorney, to not be held without cause in prison. Like, you can't be arrested without knowing what you're being arrested for. The Miranda Rights don't come along for a long time after that, but in the Constitution, the authorities have to tell you what you're being arrested for. One of the greatest fears of an Englishman, according to my law professor at Henderson, was that, like, if you were arrested and you didn't know what you were being arrested for, how long you'd be there, never getting a trial, you were just there and you had no idea what was going to happen to you. That was one of the worst things imaginable to the Founding Fathers. It's probably worse than death to them, because at least death is final, but being in prison without a trial or without a sentence goes on for you don't know how long, so it's awful. And like the right to not have troops quartered in your house, all those things are spelled out in the Constitution. Those are enumerated rights. They're written in the Constitution. They're spelled out explicitly, and they are spelled out to get rid of as much misinterpretation as possible. Opposite to enumerated rights are unenumerated rights. These are rights, of course, that are not spelled out explicitly in the Constitution. They are rights that are added that come along later. As much as people don't like it, the right to vote is not explicitly laid out in the Constitution. The right to vote was added later. The Founding Fathers did not trust every citizen to vote, especially if you weren't on if you didn't own land. If you weren't white, if you weren't male, they didn't trust you to. They did not trust you to vote for any sort of public office. You had to be a landowner. You had to be independent. You couldn't be like relying on other people. Their idea was that they wanted independent citizens. Man, is my camera messing up that bad? They wanted independent citizens to be doing the voting, not the people who were like metropolitan who like ran a business and rented their store from someone else, and you could be a millionaire, but if you didn't own land and all you owned was a couple businesses and didn't own the land they were on, you couldn't vote. Also, another unenumerated right is the right to not be a slave. That's added later via the slave amendments, of course, but spelled out originally in the Constitution. That was not a right. Later, it's added as a enumerated right, specifically spelled out. But there are several unenumerated rights that are granted to people. Like the freedom to travel isn't spelled out specifically in the Constitution, but you do have the freedom to travel. You don't have, like back in the day, if you could travel, like you can't be expelled from Kentucky now and live in Mississippi and like have to drive around Kentucky if you want to get to Illinois or whatever. Now, nowadays, if you are traveling, you can't really just be like kicked out of one state. Not allowed to travel through it. Like if you're a federal criminal, you obviously can't go. Like your travel is limited. But like the right to travel in general is not laid out word for word in the Constitution. It is a enumerated right. It is implied by the Constitution. And the right to your own body, the right to own yourself is an enumerated right. And then for 50 years, the Roe V Wade case made the precedent that is a enumerated right, that abortion because you are owning your own body, and that the law considered a fetus part of your own person, that you could have an abortion, and that was an enumerated right as a result of our bodily autonomy given to us not given to us, but protected by the federal government. So the Roe v. Wade case being overturned does a couple things. Number one, never before in history has anything like this happened, in the sense that no right has been given. I hate to use the word given because the rights are, your human rights are not given. If you aspire to the whole humanist thing, your rights aren't given. They're endowed from you by birth, by nature, or God, whatever you believe. Your right to your abortion rights were considered fundamental prior to just a couple days ago, and now they are your right to an abortion is now being protected by the states, not the federal government. What's interesting about this case, once again, there has never been a case where a right was given. I'm using that word again, but a right was accepted to exist, and then now has been rejected to exist, especially over the course of 50 years. It sets a very interesting precedent because now there's not really any sort of law that could skirt past the chopping block, per se, just based upon its age, which is kind of a good thing because there are antiquated laws that we don't need anymore. But the main thing that we're getting wrong at the root of this whole abortion argument that people are not addressing, I'm trying to keep this as unbiased as possible. Like, we cannot agree on the definition of a person. People on the right just jump to the conclusion that, like, as soon as it is, some people, not everybody on the right. There are groups of people on the right who say that, like, as soon as the cells attach to each other at inception, that person exists. Now that clump of cells has human rights because they have their own unique DNA. A lot of people will say the DNA argument because it has human DNA, but like there are other there's just the DNA argument doesn't really hold up because there's other sorts of animals that we give no rights to that have buku's amount of like human DNA. Like chimps don't have the same rights. We don't give them the same rights that we give ourselves, even though they share like 96% of the same DNA as us. There's just a fundamental misunderstanding and disagreement about what a person is. And this is going to go in the future too. This is going to play out in the form of AI. Like at some point we're going to have a autonomous intelligent artificial system that is going to be self-aware, and we have to decide, is like shutting this thing off uh, moral or immoral? Do we give that thing personhood? Like, what is a person? I've heard Ben Shapiro argue that once that person, like, people, or he's had a debate where a person on the left, I hate using that term leftist, a person who happens to be on the left, uh, said that they are not, like, the cells aren't conscious yet, they're not self aware, so therefore there's no moral issue in removing them from someone. Uh, his response to that was, like, there are people who are in comas, who are in hospital beds, who are unconscious. We have the right to pull the plug on them just because they're not self-aware. Obviously, the answer is no. But then you get into the question, like, as soon as something becomes self-aware, do we give it personhood? Who gets to define self-awareness? It doesn't matter, like, people argue about trimesters and heartbeats and nerve cells and pain and consciousness and etc. But even then, like, babies, until they're like 3 or 4, aren't self-aware. Like, they don't know that they exist yet. They're just still like a clump of cells who happen to exist outside of a person. So we do. It is impossible right now, at least, to define exactly what a human is, a definition that everyone can agree on. So what we're stuck with is this mess, which is always politics, because politics is always compromise. There is no such thing as absolute morality whenever it comes to political decisions, because everyone has different morals. You may think you're 100% right, but someone else thinks you're 100% wrong. Like, we're all people, we don't know what's going on, so we all have different opinions on stuff. There cannot be an absolute judgment on this that everyone agrees on, because people have different opinions, and so we're left with this messy conglomerate where we had Roe V Wade, which said that states can't outlaw abortion. And then you had states like Oklahoma who've outright banned it even a little beforehand, and were planning on taking it to court, yada, yada, yada. Now that it's overturned, it goes back to the states. There, you can still have an abortion in certain states, but now it is a state-to-state issue and not a federal United States issue. Now, the problem with this is, Isaac, that's, if you're pro-abortion, you'll say, or if you're pro-federally protected abortion, let me be a little more specific, you'll say that our rights are being trampled on, people should have the right to an abortion, it's my body, my choice. I get it, 100%. I get it. And you feel like that should be an absolute rule, the way that murder is absolutely illegal on a federal level, that the right to an abortion should be protected on the federal level. It's not like there's different, like, murder isn't legal in some parts of the country and illegal in other parts of the country. But the whole point of this federalist system is to have that imbalance of power between the state and the federal government. That way the federal government cannot overreach itself into the lives of citizens. And we still want the states, at least in my point of view, you want the states to still have the power to decide. That way, if you are a citizen and you disagree with a certain way of governing that a state chooses to have, you can move. It produces a political economy, a political competition between states to have the most accepted laws to the populace. And of course, culture plays a big part in it. The culture of Alabama is not the same as California. The culture of New York is not the same as Kentucky. The culture of Wisconsin is not the same culture as Illinois. There's different people who want different things, and now it's up to their state to decide what is or is not acceptable. This obviously brings a host of issues. This has been compared to gun rights, like how come guns have more freedom than women, which is just an asinine argument, because women can still go into schools and don't have to have background checks to exist, etc. But I understand where they're coming from, because it feels like we have all these mass shootings and no gun control legislation, and then we have this nonsense anti-abortion overturning that comes down from the federal court, and so we are left with these comparisons between, like, gun rights and abortion, and COVID and abortion. You have people who say my body, my choice. There's been a bunch of people on Twitter who I've seen who like taking screenshots of people who a year or two ago were all about mandated vaccines. You have to have these in your body. Now they're coming out saying my body, my choice, and they're kind of calling them out on it. But the rebuttal to that is, do you get to have autonomy to your body when your inactions will cause harms to others? This even brings up a deeper philosophical point. Are you guilty for inaction, or are you only guilty for action? And what is an inaction or an action? So, take for instance someone who's 30 years old, great health. Let's just take a Navy SEAL to make it fun. 30-year-old Navy SEAL's in great shape, exercises, is not going to die of COVID if he gets it. But he could still spread COVID to an elderly lady who's in her 80s, who doesn't have very good health, who is having breathing issues. If he spreads that to her and did not get the vaccine shot, the COVID vaccine, is he guilty of her death? A lot of people will say yes, because he did not act the best that he could to protect that person. And if you if you agree with that line of thinking, you have to ask yourself, well then, what inactions are you taking every day to not help someone? If you are sitting in your cubicle in your office and you're not out in Africa digging wells for the Tanzanian people who have no food or water, are you guilty of those Tanzanian people dying, or are you not guilty because it's like way too much of a reach? And then, like, at what point does the reach become so great that your guilt is no longer existent? And who gets to decide an action or an inaction? Can an inaction be an action? Like, if you're sitting, I made this note probably 5 or 6 months ago. Say you're sitting in a lecture hall with a person up front who is speaking, and you are sitting there, and you are you're in a group of like 200 people. Everybody's quiet. Let's say this guy's giving a presentation on psychology or whatever, and you decide to speak up and yell and disrupt everything. Most people would consider that an action that is disruptible and immoral in a way, because you're disrupting the lecture. But you could argue that you speaking is actually an inaction, because talking is natural to the human way of life, and we have to talk, and that the other people who are being quiet are actually taking an action, and even though their action is a status quo, your inaction is now breaking the rules, even though you could argue that your inaction speaking is actually an action, or your action speaking is actually an inaction, because you're not repressing yourself. So there's no way, like especially like on the libertarian point of view, you're only guilty of actions, not inactions. Like, only if you actively harm someone should you be punished by the state. But you could argue all day what an action or an inaction is. And we go back to the abortion thing and the COVID thing. If you are not going 100% to protect other people, are you guilty if they die, or is no one guilty, or is it just them, or what? Like, who decides what an action or an inaction is, and who gets to decide what a person or a non-person is? These are questions that are not going to be solved on Twitter. They're not going to be solved on Facebook by your aunt who hasn't stepped outside of her state in 20 years. It's not going to be solved on, it may be solved on YouTube through long form discussion for sure. But the problem is, like, the underlying problem is who gets to decide what a person is, and who gets to decide what an action or inaction is, and who gets to decide what gets punished. In the history of our Constitution, generally speaking, you have to commit a crime against someone, actively, quote, do something to garner the Justice Department, the police, or whoever to crack down on you and take you to jail, give you a trial, etc. Typically, inaction is not punished. Like, if you are driving down the road and you see a motorcycle wreck on the side and the guy's laying there and you just drive by, the government cannot send you to jail for not helping that person. You look at Nazi Germany, a lot of people there was a lot of inaction. People like to blame, oh, they didn't do enough to stop Hitler, blah, 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 blah. And they fail to see the fact that, like, those people in Germany were people just like they are, and that if they were in that situation, they probably would have done the same inaction. Are those people who did not commit an action guilty of the people who committed an action? And who gets to decide if an inaction is an action or not? And then you get to the gun control debate, which is just for the Second Amendment guys, it's absolutely terrible. With this, it's not terrible from their point of view for the most part, because most of those guys are conservatives. For the most part, timing is way bad for this, because we had back-to-back shootings in Buffalo, and then Uvalde in Texas. A lot of kids got killed. Not really any gun control legislation has been passed, and all of a sudden now, on the flip side of the coin, abortion, which the liberals thought that had been solved half a decade ago, is now back to the states and has lost its federal protection, and everybody is comparing abortion to gun control. Why aren't we cracking down on guns? It's the same question about inaction and action. The Second Amendment conservative guys will say, me owning a rifle does not dictate my wanting to harm someone. Me owning an AR-15 does not necessarily mean that I'm going to go out and harm someone, so why should I have my right to own those weapons taken away just to fix the problem that I had nothing to do with? And then the people on the left will say, well, you are, by having these open gun laws in the United States, we are, by taking an inaction, letting these people commit these crimes because we're not doing anything to stop it, and we're guilty of not doing anything to stop it, so we're in the wrong. And then you have this fundamental clash again. Conservatives saying that my inaction in the crime gives me justification to own my own gun. And then the lefties will say, your inaction is the reason why these shootings happen, and so we have to do something to change it. You'll see this a lot when it comes to left versus right arguments. The leftists, and this is not just now, this is liberals ever since we've had humanism arise and have modern democracies and republics. The liberals always say we're not doing enough and we have to take charge and change this, and the conservatives say we've already done something, it's not our fault for not doing it. And you really have to ask yourself, like, what is the function of the both sides? And in my opinion, you can't have a government without both sides, because the liberals push the agenda in the direction that it's going to go to anyways. Like, any conservative, except for like the most diehard, ethnic, superior, far right, like the crazy extremist conservatives. If you take your average conservative now, like, gay marriage hasn't been brought up in like over a decade. Like, most conservatives don't care if you're gay and you get married. Like, we don't care. As far as like taxes go, like, we're acceptable paying more than what they used to. Like, if you took the average conservative back to 1944, they would be the biggest lefty in the 40s. They would be like at the University of Berkeley protesting on college campuses because the liberal and conservative values in the 40s were completely different than the liberal and conservative values in the 21st century, especially in our second decade we're in now. And so, like, you can have a liberal, and that always, like, society always moves. Like, we've been moving towards a more liberal, we've been moving to a more liberal way of life for the last, 300 years really, since the scientific revolution and since our modern democracies and republics. But the conservatives are there to make sure that things don't change so fast that the entire structure collapses. Because if you just have a complete, like a liberal's dream to go through and overturn, and not like a classical liberal, like a modern, far leftist liberal, their dream to overturn everything and then to have these structures in society completely redone, society falls apart because, like, there's no common thread tying us all together anymore. And the conservatives, because they're trying to go back to this like glory days of they're trying to conserve what America was, go back to the glory days of like the 80s. We had a booming economy, blah 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 blah, like strong military. They're all about like this American ideal that doesn't really exist. You can't let either one have their way because it turns into complete chaos. If you have fundamentalist conservatives who aren't willing to ever move the needle, then society stagnates and we don't grow as a country, and a lot of people become disenfranchised. And then on the other side, if you have the liberals carry out their stuff, their dreams all the way through, we have no society because all of our institutions get overturned. If we pack the court and pack the court and pack the court, eventually, like, the Supreme Court doesn't really hold any weight because the next president can come along and appoint 4 new judges and get whatever he wants to pass, and we lose that structure. And then that's a real possibility. And it would have to take a lot more than an abortion law to convince me that packing the court is necessary. Because once you start packing the court and you set the precedent, which almost happened with our boy FDR, threatened to do that before they got the depression relief stuff passed. If that happens, man, like there's no more cornerstone of American democracy, because now any president can come in and just shift it however they want to, which is not good. Like that is the first step in destruction of our system, because like the Supreme Court is the strongest legal court in the world, and when it can be manipulated by any president over the course of 4 years, it loses a lot of its eligibility and a lot of its legitimacy. So it would have to take something extremely horrible for the Supreme Court to be packed. And a lot of people think this is it, that the Roe v. Wade overturn is the reason for the court to be packed, and most people, and a lot of people think that it's not. But the balance between Republican and Democrat, conservative, and liberal, and then the libertarians are thrown in there in the middle, and the people who are just middle anyways. I really believe most people in the country are just middle of the road, but they're forced to pick between these two extremes, which sucks. We're left with a question of like, are inactions are we guilty? Is an inaction as guilt inducing as an action? Who gets to decide what an action or inaction is? And are these people in power going to make the decisions that trickle down to us, as opposed to like if we don't do something, like are we guilty for not doing something? One of the most famous instances, you look at the Fugitive Slave Act. In the North, if a slave ran away and you did not turn him into the government could find you guilty, which is awful, of course. But it's the inaction, and it was overturned later, of course, because of the Civil War. The government cannot really find you guilty for an inaction. They're not supposed to, at least. But then you have to argue like, what's an action? What's an inaction? Who gets to decide? So here we are. Roe v. Wade's overturned. I don't know what's going to happen. The protests haven't been violent, which is great as far as I can tell. There has been no attack on churches that have made the news. I've been watching the news. Nothing's happened yet. I think it's very interesting to see the pro-abortion people compare this to COVID, and really get to see people thinking that inactions can render you guilty, which I think is kind of a scary precedent. We don't really go down that. I don't think the government should be able to arrest you if you didn't do anything. Like literally, like did not do. Like if you did not get the COVID shot, people shouldn't have been arrested for that, even though it was the smart decision to get it. But people shouldn't be arrested for not helping someone on the side of the road. Like if you shoot someone on the side of the road, that's an action. Not helping someone is an inaction. But some people argue that not helping someone is an action. So who do we get? Who gets to decide? You know, the Supreme Court gets to decide. And if we start packing the court, things can get really gnarly really quick. And it's probably not a good thing in the long run, even though a lot of people think that it's necessary to overturn the overturning for Roe v. Wade. It'll be interesting to see. All these comparisons are ecstatic. All these people who are doing the comparison are ecstatic about this. The gun control stuff getting brought up in comparison to Roe v. Wade is very interesting. But I don't know. I think the solution is open-ended discussion between parties. Find people in the middle who can get stuff done. For the most part, abortion is still legal in most of the United States. People who still want to get abortions are going to get abortions. And then like the people on the liberal side will say, well, if you think abortion, like talking about gun control and abortion control, people will say, well, abortion control doesn't stop people from getting abortions, and you say gun control doesn't stop people from getting guns, so why even like bother trying to limit abortions? Which is a fantastic argument. But the flip side of that is, the right wingers will say, if you're so prone to banning guns and you want to ban guns and we want to ban this, why can't we ban stuff like you want to ban stuff? Which is something we'll talk about in another episode soon, about how whenever a situation arises and it involves two groups and there's agreed upon rules. Let me set it up like this. This will be our next episode. Imagine a group of people living in like 1500 in England who are growing their own wheat for food. Okay, two groups of people: A group and the B group. We'll call them the A group and the 1 group. A group has 1,000 acres of wheat. They have some terrible bug come through that kills all their wheat. They're going to starve to death. Group 1, we'll call them B group now because I'm already getting confused. Group B has 1,000 acres of wheat. They have a surplus, and now Group A sneaks in the middle of the night and takes all of their wheat back to them, and now Group B is left with barely enough food to survive, but both groups generally do survive. Next year, the situation is flipped. Next season, when the wheat harvest comes around, let's say a genetic mutation sweeps its way through Group B's crop. They're left with nothing. And now they're looking at Group A saying, they stole from us last year. Are we justified in stealing from them because they stole from us? But we already said, we agreed that stealing was wrong prior. And so are we going to be the bigger people and not steal because it's our principle? Or is it now justified because Group A initiated it? So now Group A is stolen from Group B, and now Group B is in the same situation that Group A was last year. And they have to decide if they're actually going to go in there and steal stuff or if they're going to abide by their principles. And this is what happens all the time in modern politics. Like Group A and Group B getting an argument about stuff. Well, you did this. Well, yeah, but you did that. And then they both did each other's thing. And now there's no baseline of like morality. Group A grows wheat. They lose all their crop, steal from Group B. A year goes by, Group B loses all their crop. They're in a position now. Has the status quo changed, or are we still going to rely on our principles and morals regardless of what the other side does? And that, my friend, is modern politics, and that will be our next episode of the Dumb Before Dawn podcast. I will see y'all later. Thank y'all for tuning in. I got a job. I can't wait to teach. I'm going to be teaching history and civics at the Hot Springs Junior High next year and driving a bus. Very excited. And been working on my book. I've got my first, this is a really short, rough draft. This is like maybe a quarter or a third of the book printed out that I've been editing and working on. I'm going to try to get halfway through by the end of the year. Y'all don't care about that. Y'all don't even care about me. Y'all don't care about this podcast. It's fine. Whatever. I will see y'all next time.